Welcome to the Future of Funding podcast, where we head away from the more commonly discussed challenges of fundraising and instead deep dive into sometimes life-changing and sadly sometimes more soul-destroying experiences that nonprofits go through, both during and after receiving money from their funders. The aim of the podcast is to draw out lessons and insights which we hope will power the future of how funding drives, enables, and amplifies impact. So, Deborah, thank you so much for joining us today. I guess I wanted to start by focusing on some of the better practices that you've encountered in your journey, helpful funding approaches or conditions that enabled you to operate better, feel better, generate better impact. Top 3, if you can think of them.
Well, thank you for having me on the show. I mean, I'm honored that you value my sharings today. And having been in the nonprofit scene now since 2008, and Fugee organization is 16 years, going on 17 years. It's been a while. So I guess perhaps to talk a little bit about the work we do, we predominantly work with the refugee community in Malaysia. They are essentially not legal, right? So we're working with a very vulnerable, marginalized group that are essentially invisible in this country, have no safety net, and can be arrested and detained at any point. So our job is already very hard. We're swimming upstream. The funding environment in Malaysia is hostile. If there are the big bucks being given away, we get the crumbs. And so it puts you in a very different state of mind as an individual that's fundraising, but also as your organization. It affects how you dream, your vision, what the future looks like, and then everything else. So that's a little bit of the context. And that's really the way it's been since I founded Fugee in 2009. It reminds me of this story I had with a bunch of funders. So coming out of COVID, it was 2022, and there were a bunch of funders that were from Singapore, and they had been wanting to visit Malaysia to learn about the refugee situation, who the players were, what it was like on the ground, and what refugees were really going through every day. Their visit was delayed because of COVID, and eventually they made it. And one of their stops was at Fugee. They met some of our students. We gave them a presentation and talked to them about how we survived COVID and what we were looking to do. And I remember one of the funders asked me this question towards the end of the presentation. He said, "Deborah, you're the founder. What is your dream for your organization?" And I remember this because I think I mumbled a bunch of random things, trying to sound like I had it all figured out, and probably didn't convince him. He's a pretty switched on guy. And I guess my learnings from that were I felt a little bit embarrassed, felt like I didn't give a very good answer. I didn't have a clear vision. And I guess in my defense, or perhaps to explain it, it was coming out of COVID, we were living month to month. We had existed so long in a situation of scarcity that I think myself as the leader, as the founder, I didn't think far. So that was an interesting learning experience for me and really woke me up. If I wanted to really change how I was leading my organization, but also in the sector, my whole mindset needed to change. And that's not an easy thing. So 2 things that stood out to me with these funders was one, the education part. They were really interested in understanding us, really learning about us, about the sector, about refugees. They wanted to meet as many people as possible and really understand, because I think they were very committed to the domain. The second was trust. And in hindsight, I can see that getting to really know us as individuals and building that trust allowed them to take a step back and be a lot more relaxed. When it came to decision making, they weren't obsessed with the micro decision making. Once they trusted you, your vision, they gave you a lot more freedom and flexibility. Fast forward a few years now, I see those were some of the more important building blocks.
To summarize then, the 2 helpful practices that you've highlighted here would be that they took the time to try and understand you as individuals and organizations, and that allowed them to establish trust. So do you feel that then allowed them to feel more confident about supporting you in the way that you needed to be supported? What role does that trust play in it being a helpful practice? That I'd be curious to just open that up.
It was very much mutual. It wasn't that they just trusted us. They could see gaps. So that's where maybe certain expertise that they have, they could identify and perhaps guide us with, do you need support? Do you need capacity? Do you need mentors? Or this is what we can offer. We can connect you with other people in our networks. Often there's a power dynamic, right? There's a funder and then you sit below. But I think it also then helped us build that relationship with them where we had that confidence and trust to go to them, to trust that they would be then we could reach out to them for things that we needed, or if we didn't like something or had preferences.
The reason I picked that up as more looking at it from the funder side, because if you look at the normal operational life of a nonprofit, whether you trust that funder or not has little to do with anything beyond whether or not you are going to share your failures with them or not in a sensible fashion. Once they accept your application, they're going to transfer you the money, and then you have to proceed in whatever way their rule set was. The other way around, the reason I look at trust as having a bigger effect when the funder is able to trust the nonprofit is that the nonprofit then should ideally experience a completely different set of behaviors from that funder than they do from other funders that don't trust them or haven't taken the time to establish that trust. So I guess that might be interesting to explore as a comparison even with other funders that you've been through and how that's played out differently for you.
Yeah, actually, that's interesting because we recently got a grant from a bigger Malaysian-based funder. I think we were one of probably hundreds of applications. It was the first time that we got a grant from them. It's quite a detailed application process and reporting process, and the money comes in tranches. Towards the end of that cycle, they encouraged us to reapply the following year, and they said go for a bigger, higher, larger amount. They didn't give us perhaps enough feedback on last year's, and then perhaps on this application, they could have perhaps guided us a little bit more with feedback on the application. That didn't happen. And then obviously the grant cycle takes quite a few months. So by the time we found out that we didn't get accepted, we were a little bit alarmed about it. And obviously, and you want to learn, you want to know what you did that perhaps was not ideal, or what were the gaps, or did we not answer the right questions? Eventually, we got a little bit of feedback from them, but it's too late. I mean, you talk about trust. The trust was there to give us the first grant. I mean, it's a much bigger organization, so there's so many levels. Often the people approving it don't even know who you are. They're basing you off a piece of paper and your budget and what you say you're going to do. So I think that was the case here. And it's an interesting thing because trust was there in year one, but year two, we didn't get it because there were gaps in our proposal. And so we'll have to wait to next year's cycle. So I guess especially when you're talking about big funders, they're dealing with hundreds of millions of dollars, huge number of applications. How do you still maintain that personal relationship and really know and really have genuine, like how does that work? I'm curious with that.
I mean, it's an interesting one, right? Which comes back to the process before funding is handed out. Due diligence can be used just as a one-way thing, which is I gather information about you to decide from my end whether I am interested in you or not. Or if you're wise about it, you can use it to establish trust and relationships, which is critical. And then depending on how well that's done, it comes down to how much effort that organization continues to make during the process of selecting you and then post the process of selecting you in terms of whether they maintain an active relationship. So maybe that's another talking of good practices. So you've got the practice of establishing a position of trust, where you are financing nonprofits only once you feel you trust them, doing what's necessary to get to a place where you can trust them. And then alongside that is the second bit, which is establishing and then maintaining an active relationship. And it sounds like this other organization may have trusted you to provide you funding once, but then they didn't maintain the kind of relationships that were necessary for both of you, but really for you as a nonprofit in this particular instance, to have any awareness of what they were trying to do. So then you end up in this slightly one-sided informational and relational exercise.
I imagine if they like us, right? They like us, they like what we do, they like our work and where we're headed. If I was them, I'd be like, oh, I'd like to work with them again. And if their application wasn't quite ideal, how can I help them make those adjustments to give them the money, right? But
there's no reason why you can't. If those things are important, then the way you should be setting up your funding practice is that those two things become an active part of how you operate your fund. And actually, even before you moved on to the trust piece, one of the points you brought up was about trying to understand the domain and you and what you do. I guess the question is, would you rather be working with a funder that needed to be educated about your domain, or working with a funder that already understood your domain and could relate fast and easily to the what and the why of what you're doing. I can give you an example from my end. When I was running, Make a Difference and other nonprofits and so on, the amount of times funders would come in and then start to ask basic questions about the domain. So if you are proposing a solution, then they want to know why. Why do we need that? Why should we spend the money on that? And actually, if you understood anything about that domain, it would be a ridiculous question to ask. It's like saying, why should we finance food for children? What about free school meals? Anyone that actually understands poverty and low income and education would understand that link straight away. They would understand that if children are undernutritioned, it's almost impossible for them to learn, aside from all of the other stunting that takes place. So if you then were to put that solution forward, your funder should just go, yeah. Alternatively, there should be, why don't you have free meals? Why are we not financing free meals? So I guess this is where I'm leading into a topic of good practice, which is, in your experience of all the funders, not just the ones you have now, what percentage would you say understood your domain in an acceptable way?
Very little, very small percentage. And I think they either don't understand it, so they let you do whatever and they just want to give the money away and forget about it. So that could be a good thing. Or they don't understand it and they come back with a million questions and make you sweat and make you stressed. And they require a degree of reporting that is just not feasible for you. But yes, in general, it's been a very small percentage that understand the refugee landscape. I mean, we're still having conversations about the difference between a refugee and a migrant worker or a stateless person. You're still dealing with these kind of conversations.
That's an interesting norm, isn't it? That we've almost come to expect and accept that funders aren't going to know these things. And I'd be interested in your thoughts on that, because you're dealing with a player that has more than enough financing to educate themselves in advance of any of this, or to hire people that have already got that deep domain experience. So I wonder what your thoughts are on the fact that we are consistently encountering funders and financiers, philanthropists included, that haven't done that pre-work. So they are learning while giving. And that only takes you to a certain point. There's only so much you can pick up by visiting organizations and talking to leaders once in a while. What's your thoughts on that as a practice, or as what should be a good practice in the system?
We've had some funders that have come in and we're always trying to ask for the bare minimum and over justifying and over explaining ourselves. So it was a relief when we had funders that came in and they were like, how much do you need to run your organization this year? And okay, we're going to underwrite it for the next 3 years. You don't have to worry about these costs. You go and do what you need to do. And that was a breath of fresh air for us. It allowed us to de-stress and go, okay, guys, what do we need to do here? How do we get the foundation set up well? So that was something that gave us a breathing space to plan. We could allocate funds where we needed it the most. We didn't have to worry about all this nitty-gritty and reporting or operational costs, capacity building, hiring maybe one or two key people at the beginning. And so this flexibility also affects leadership, because we think differently and act differently. It allowed us to respond to the challenges that we were facing, be more agile. It was a commitment of, okay, 3 years and let's see how things go. Doesn't require any major reporting, but of course we then determine what we would like to give the funder. He visits us annually. He's vested in the team, sharings, our growth, our mission. We've invited them to be judges and on the panel for some of our programmatic work that we do. And so what I think is interesting, it's a shift away from this charity mindset that I think a lot of perhaps in Malaysia funders have, which is it's alms for the poor. I'm giving and I'm altruistic, like a savior mindset. And in this bare minimum where, oh, I just give you enough to survive. And then we have this mindset of, do you know it only costs 50 ringgit to educate a child? Our challenge to ourselves was almost, how cheap can we make a child's education? We were thinking this way, and I think we spoke about this, where and you asked me once, I think you went, why do you have to justify how cheap your education is? Raise the bar, you're giving your kids, it should be a great education, not the bare minimum. So it was that shift, even from the funders, from that charity mindset where we moved towards, we recognized that we needed to build capacity. We had to hire right. That was a critical component of our future goals. We could do workshops. We could take care of the mental well-being of our staff. And also then we could work with them collaboratively. So we listened to each other. We co-designed. We got advice from each other. They were like a real partner. And I think that was an interesting, I guess, power shift, if you will, that allowed it to become more of a real partnership. Those are positive things.
We picked up 5 different points you've made here, which is funders trying to at least understand the domain or build an understanding of the domain that they are funding. There's effort going into establishing whether organizations can be trusted and then following through on that trust with an active engagement and active investment in success of those organizations. Which actually leads me to an interesting question across the continuum of your funders. How often or how clear are the impact targets of that particular funder or your funders to you? So what I mean is, just to clarify, it's quite common that funders will expect some target commitment from you as a nonprofit. It's much less common that the funder turns around and says, our goal is to see 1 million refugee children thriving against these 4 markers. That's our goal. That's what our money is going to go to, as compared to the funder having no specific goal at all and no actual impact target. And then either expecting that from you as an organization or not expecting too much and just generally happy with where you're going. What would you say is the norm in your experience?
So past experience, a lot of the funders, it's tied to a very specific proposal. So if it's a very small proposal, with a school, it can be a little bit more challenging to show that precise impact that's immediate, but it's more like on your output, like X number of students have access to this program or are enrolled in this. It becomes all about, we did a training workshop for 10 refugee teachers. It becomes these things, right? Which you can potentially easily do, but whether it's a real solid, meaningful outcome is another thing. So that's something we've also learned, because then you get so caught up on these outputs that you think you've done good, but actually, are you really changing things? Not really, but I think we have a lot of our recent funders, they don't come with these expectations. That's where, in some cases, I think with Fugee School, it's a little bit harder because it's, I guess, long-term outcomes that we're looking at.
But if you're not clear as to what anybody's expectations are, it's very easy to fail those expectations later. When you get there and people are like, well, this isn't quite what we were expecting. On the first glance, you'd be like, a funder that doesn't really care about specific impact outcomes or output-based outcomes. Any of these things is great because we can just utilize their money. But if you look at it a little bit more deeply, there's a lot of room in that journey then to either just settle into utilizing money, which is a very common failure point for nonprofits in the long term when they do get funding like that, when the landscape changes and that funder walks away and suddenly there is really little to show. You've just done stuff. Also, the other side of it is, without the pressure to do those things, is that helpful to you or not? How do you get to a negotiation point 3 years later where you're like, you should give us another round of money because we exceeded your expectation? How can you do that?
A lot of the funders, we've said, for example, this is a school, these are our 5-year goals, this is where we're headed. It's not going to happen overnight. It's going to take time. So, for example, building a better teacher base, that involves training, involves hiring, that takes time, developing the curriculum, implementing more technology, implementing this, So they know the plan, they know where we're headed. We update them with the reports. So that's a long-term thing, right? So then to your point, I get that if we're not holding ourselves accountable, they could just be like, oh, okay, and walk away.
Well, it's an interesting thing because even the things you mentioned, they're still outputs. You see what I mean? Better teaching, better training, better infrastructure. Even though it's long-term, can take you 5 years to put it in place. I'm sure you'll be experiencing this already if you aren't, which is at some point, your enterprise has been around a long time and long enough to be able to see graduates. And then there's got to be the expectation that says, what happened to them? And, many of the nonprofits that I worked with, hundreds of them over the years now, they have no idea. And in many, many ways, the reason they have no idea is partly because there was no pressure to do that tracking. So they never really did. And because funders weren't looking for that, nobody's financing the tracking. So you kind of have this dual gap, which is you got no driver but you also have no financing because people don't want to put the money. So you suddenly end up with 20,000 graduates. And when someone says, well, can you tell us what happened to the 20,000? Well, we don't know. It's great to get money without, let's call them unreasonable expectations. But I think money with reasonable expectation is also potentially very helpful and healthy for nonprofits, especially if it's mixed with those other things that you had in there, which is an active trust-based relationship and the potential for ongoing commitments. But the funder also has to recognize that if they are not clear about what they would constitute as success, enough for them to finance you again, you're really operating blind into that 3-year timeline.
This has been a learning for us where, like, just trying to be focused so much on having enough money to keep things going, we couldn't think long term, right? So tracking alumni, ensuring your students are actually graduating out of school, tracking what they do next, tracking your alumni, making sure they have further opportunity are all things perhaps we've started working on in the past 4 years as an organization. So from a Fugee School perspective, that's where we are right now. And it's actually us that are making these commitments to our funders, going, these are the goals, 80% graduation rate out of grade 9 or GED. And then we track how many of them get into our scholarship program, trying to be more intentional with that and follow them, right? And then it's only with our higher ed program, which is our higher education program, which offers scholarships. That's a lot more specific. So the funders who fund that get very clear outcomes. Because it's newer, it's designed differently, that's a lot more specific.
Given that you've been in play for quite a long time and you're now implementing or thinking about these things, how much of a role do you think funder behavior has played in it taking this long for you to be able to activate that? Or is it just that that's how long it took you to wrap your head around it? Would you have got to this earlier if financing valued this and pushed for this and was looking to support you in the long term?
Yeah, that's a good question. I think a bit of both. So personally, I think my own personal education, even commitment, because in the past I was a lot more part-time and I left it to the people I hired to run the school. So I think it was my own personal commitment to Fugee. But also at the same time, I think the limited funding and that stress, because the fundraising sits with me predominantly, that stress on me really just did not allow me to think much further. And I think, to be honest, the hope of like who is going to fund refugees in Malaysia was just diminishing. So it was very much you were in a desperate situation, in a survival mode, and you would design proposals to get the money versus the other way around, right? So everything you were doing, I think, was not ideal.
Which is a shame, right? Because if we come back to the point that we were discussing a little earlier about for the funders themselves don't have their own impact or outcome targets, metrics, or goals, means that they are not investing in local sectors in a way to further those outcomes. There's no strategic investment in organizations. If there's 100,000 refugees and you want their outcomes to be better and you're not going to execute, then you should be investing in organizations that can then address that 100,000. Even if those organizations are fledgling, if they don't exist at all, you'd want to start encouraging their startup and supporting that journey. But that's a very interesting gap, I feel.
And also with the number of funders, and these are your MNCs, these are your local conglomerates, the CSR, and then what's the cool topic of the day? So this year we're going to support women, and next year we're going to support animals. And it's not like they're supporting these causes with hundreds and thousands of dollars. It's like 30,000 ringgit, 50,000 ringgit. What do you think is going to change with this amount of money? Nothing's going to change. This idea that they can just tick the box for this year, International Women's Day, let's do a run, let's raise money, we're going to give it, and then next year we're moving on. I don't know what that is. Is it a lack of understanding, a lack of commitment? And I've said this to some of them before. It's like, you got to pick something and stick with it. At least like 5 years.
Yeah. So, actually, this segues us nicely into the second part of this conversation, which is to talk about your top 3 or 5 unhelpful practices or stress-inducing practices that you've experienced as an organizational leader across your career. From funders, from the receiving of money, the post-receiving of money, post-grant, what would you say are your top 3 or 5 most stress-inducing or most unhelpful practices? I mean, you started with a couple already.
I think one is very restrictive funding, where if you don't spend it on this, you have to return it. Especially in this sector, you're not big established nonprofits with a very huge capable staff base, employee base. I've heard many stories from peers where they regret getting the grant because the funding is so rigorous. They are exhausted, they are stressed just doing the reporting. And it feels like it defeats the purpose. Those grants are probably made for these very big international organizations that have done this a million times before and are used to it. I think when you go through that experience once, it's so harrowing that you will never apply for that grant again. And then often just to get the grant, the kind of things that you need to commit to are also a little bit idealistic.
Like an example that you remember? I don't mean the funder, but just the conditions, for example, or the nature of reporting that you found to be exhausting.
Yeah, it's just every time you want to reallocate money to something else, you need to get permission, even for small amounts. We applied for a grant, I think it was with an Australian, but it was a little bit of like a tech, an app. So you kind of, first time doing it, you overpromise on a lot of things. You're working with the refugee community, so some of the youth, and it's a huge learning curve for them. Ultimately, there were many positives that came from it. The growth was great, the experience was great, but was the app really functional at the end of the day? No. So you kind of have to weigh it out. Was it worth the money spent? So those were like learnings for us.
When you said as an app, is that something that somebody else proposed to you, or you were looking to build an app and then they gave you money, or what happened?
Yeah, it was a few years back. And then we designed it to help. It was the idea of helping to keep children in school by creating an app that would allow for community members and youth to do the household chores and to help parents, families. So it was an interesting model. But I think just for us, it was the first time doing something like this. And a lot of new learnings, working very closely with the youth. That was a massive learning curve for them. And it was very much refugee-led at the same time. I see them today and they're amazing individuals that have grown a lot and have gone on to university, leaders in their own right, and they've continued to do things. Interesting learning experiences for us. But that's just an example where you have the opportunity to apply for something and it's a lot of money and you're like, yes, let's do it because the money's going to help somehow. Like if you asked me to do that today, we've consciously not applied for many grants because we're like, nope, that's not what we want. It's going to give us more stress.
I'd love to talk a little bit more about this, about stress as a decision factor. Obviously, something you've learned the hard way. Let's dive a little bit into that because this is something that I think is widely overlooked by our sector, which is how stress-inducing a lot of the financing aspects of trying to help people is. So, yeah, what would you say been the most stressful times you've gone through and why? Have you ever felt let down by funders?
I mean, not so much after we get the money. This is more promises of money, and then they don't.
Okay.
Times when I get a promise and I then account for that in budgeting and spending, and then I have to chase them, and then it falls after 3 months of trying. What can I do? I have to drop it, right? So I've had stress from funders in that regard with money.
Yeah, once an agreement, verbal or written or whatever, is made, then you have to rely on that, right? I mean, as a nonprofit, you can't carry on fundraising for the same thing. And I feel that that's one aspect where it doesn't come through at all. And then there's the other aspect where you can't control the time frame of when it comes through. So it's supposed to land in 3 months, and then 3 months later, people are still taking their sweet time, and then it's 6 months later, and then it's 8 months later, and it still lands, but there's no appreciation of what that does to you as an enterprise while you are waiting.
Yeah. It's a trickle-down effect. It affects whoever's dealing with it one-on-one. It affects your state of mind. It causes you personal stress. You've made promises now to the team, which then affect them. It affects your programs. It affects everything, right? So it's got this whole domino effect as well. But also what comes to mind is not just money funders, but also we have a lot of partners in kind. So we'll have volunteer partners, we have implementation program partners with the school, and it also happens there. It may not be dollars and cents, but you have commitments of volunteers coming in running programs they don't show. You have corporations that want to do CSR and then things fall apart. You have commitments of gadgets, like we'll donate laptops, we'll donate books. That also has no timeline and you have to chase them. And I think we've also spoken about this before, but I don't know if they're conscious or, I mean, everyone's, I guess, busy, but if they're conscious about how their delays really impact you and your ability to serve your community. And do you say this to them? Do you chase them? How do nonprofits communicate this in a respectful but serious way, right? People, the partners you work with really appreciate that when you commit to something.
Yeah.
So pivoted away from volunteers and unpaid because we can't rely on it. So now we have a full paid staff. Everything else on top of that is additional. And then we are very careful with how we select those partners.
Yes, I guess the summary of that is it needs to be timely and reliable, right? Both of those aspects matter. The timeliness is something that I feel funders don't appreciate because they're never in that position themselves. Living a life where your salaries are waiting for the board to release money. So all of you are on tenterhooks for 5 months while somebody's in the Bahamas, or they didn't have that board meeting that quarter, so it's got to be another quarter. And you're wondering, do I start looking for another job? Is this ending? Or what do I do? It's so rare that you ever encounter that in a company. You might get laid off in a company goes down, but it's very rare that you are in a regularly or cyclically in a scenario like this where you're waiting on whether or not money comes through. And I think some small business owners certainly experience a good aspect of that when it comes to cash flow, suppliers and vendors and people not paying or when they should be paying. I do feel like by the time you get to people with a lot of money and organizations that are operating with large budgets, most of the people have never been through that as an experience. So I guess it's not something that even occurs to them. And what's really interesting is I think people don't even think of nonprofits as companies. It's just nonprofit company. Profit company. The company bit remains the company bit. And the best equivalent is that if you look at a startup in an investable space, they have to go raise money to be able to operate. So the first 6, 7, 8, whatever years, they're raising rounds of money to stay alive, to get to a point of sustainability, which is tedious, right? Everybody's trying to get out of that mess. But if you think about it from a nonprofit's perspective, the way regulation is set up, because nonprofits cannot generate their own financing, you have to go do that round raising every single year on a rolling basis. And I think the wider commercial system, which everybody belongs to, just doesn't appreciate how difficult that is.
So I think even just to use the language company in that sentence scares people.
I do feel like there's a massive bias, commercial system bias, that spills a lot into funder behavior, because going back to what you talked about trust, is that if you're coming up through a long history of mistrusting people in the non-profit sector, it's very hard for you to then start shifting that position. You're looking for controls because your starting point is, I'm worried that somebody else is going to misuse my $100,000, without realizing that these organizations' basic operating costs are $500,000 and everybody's on a 30% of commercial value salary.
As someone who's from the nonprofit world, I also reflect on ourselves. We often have this, who's going to go out and do this kind of thankless work? It's bleeding hearts, but no business skills. So it's a double whammy. On one hand, these are really kind people that care, but they may lack the skill set, which then in turn turns away funders, because a funder's going to look at you and think, I don't think this guy knows how to manage a budget, right? But on the other hand, if you say we run like a business, that also scares people. So it's finding that sweet spot. And I think on the funders that work with us and some of our peers, what do they see in us that they potentially liked that made them go, okay, we trust these guys and we want to establish a working relationship with them. But also then funders pull together. So if my friend funds them, that means it must be good. I trust him. So so it's this whole relationship building that comes into play as well.
There's an upside and a downside to that, right? The upside to that for organizations that are in that zone is that a lot of funders will just, because ex-funders said they trust and everybody else says, yeah, good. But then, of course, what it can do is if you don't happen to be inside that pool or inside that little network, funding is all getting diverted away from you towards, it's like a snowball effect for a lot of organizations. And you do see this even globally. You see a lot of scaled up non-profit organizations. They've scaled up not because they make any real impact. They've scaled up because they were backed by an evangelist that was well connected. And then everybody else just goes with that flow, and then suddenly you can end up with too much money that's beyond your ability to utilize it well, or you just pump it into visible scale, which again, it's not related to outcomes, it's outputs, right? So if I go back to the practices that you found to be stressful, just repeat them back. Switching domains, just randomly year on year, switching to different things. So there's no consistency for you to be in their funding pool. You've no idea what's coming next year. Small monies, not financing at a level that is genuinely useful, especially for those issues. Very restricted funding is a point I think you made, which I think is a very important one, a very stress-inducing exercise. And it can become very difficult and costly to be able to manage that funding in a real life environment that doesn't work like that. And then along with that comes that exhausting reporting that you mentioned.
Because we make promises, we're still dealing with humans here. You can't control them. So with beneficiaries, we're making promises based on our knowledge. Things can change and things should change. You should be able to go, there's a better way to do it. Oh, this way is not working. Let's adjust. So how do we be agile and still make those commitments and still be trusted to deliver?
Especially the reallocations where there's a lot of restriction on reallocation. There's no flexibility for enterprises. This is all completely opposite to how the commercial sector works. Once you've established that this is the amount of investment required for that financial outcome or that customer acquisition outcome, then in real time, the team's got to be left to utilize that money off plan if that's the case. And you're right in that for us in the nonprofit sector, that's pretty rare, isn't it? Like every time you need to change something or drop something, even if you save a lot of money, let's say you innovate, save half that cost, there's a potential to have to return that money instead of just utilize that money for other things.
What stressed me out is when you've already got the money and when it comes to reporting, you're not going to be able to give them these outputs, right? And then that stress of did we just not do our job? Did we overcommit? Were we being idealistic here, unrealistic? I think that whole thing, it's unhealthy and it's stress inducing. Another thing I think of is the beneficiaries, right? We don't talk about them enough. And a key part of the work we do, once again, to use the word trust, is building trust with them. These are communities that are very vulnerable. They come from all over the world. They've gone through trauma. They've got different cultures, different languages. And it took us a good few years to be able to get the trust of the parents, where now, if we want to take their kids anywhere, parents will say, go for it. But back then, it wasn't the case. So when you have issues of funding, and I've made commitments to them to say, do English classes or to do programs for the kids, and my funding gets cut or runs out, I have to stop. And I could give them 100 good reasons and it's not going to matter. The fact is I stopped and now they can't come. And the next time I get funding and I ask them to come back, are they going to come? Are they going to trust me? And then the start, stop situation, the people move on, right? And they just get on with life. Even at the community level with, say, access to schools. So we know in the refugee sector, secondary education is limited depending on where refugees live. So in parts of Penang, in Kedah, what happens is when they finish primary, they have no immediate school to go to for high school. And eventually, because they're out of school, parents will decide to get the kids married off or to get the kids to start working. Why are you sitting at home doing nothing? I might as well get some value out of you, right? So once again, you see where lack of funding or lack of sector development leads.
I think that's a really, really important point. That's probably my favorite point you've made so far, which is that it's not just the operational stresses and psychological effects of these things on the teams, but there is a spillover effect on beneficiaries and recipients, and they can't appreciate the fact that there's another party behind you. You're the player. It's you. Either you fail them or you succeed them, if that makes sense. They can trust you or they can't trust you. But also it's their lives, and I always maintain this both to nonprofits and to funders. Right? In the end, you're just messing around with other people's lives. They have no power to hold anybody accountable. Nonprofits have no power to hold funders accountable. The beneficiary has no power to hold anyone accountable. So you just get derailed by people who are experimenting or are hobbying for a while in that space. And then when those two things finish, or when the hobby just decides they need another hobby and the experimenter decides, well, this experiment didn't work, that person, family, or community is still sitting there, often worse off than they were because they got derailed. Like you said, imagine you take me from my school and I put you in a new school and that school closes down 2 years later. I'm now off the curriculum. I'm in another thing altogether. How do I slot back into my old scenario? Also, my expectations have all changed. Can I slot back into that scenario? Am I even physically, geographically in the same place that I was? I feel that's a really, really good point. And I guess leads us into the last bit of this conversation, really, which is about the future of funding and what it should look like to be the most effective it could be. What are your thoughts on that? What would you say the ideal fund would look like?
I was thinking about this at what exists right now around the world, and I don't know if I'm right. You can chime in, but I think of the arts sector So if I look at the West, the US, and in parts of Europe, perhaps, where it's maybe more mature, you have organizations, philanthropists, family funds that really support the arts. It's like an ecosystem that they really support. If I imagine, like just from what I've read, it's the schools, they're training young people, whether it's performing arts or dance or music or arts, the culture of the country, right? How do you preserve it? So I think it's training, it's job creation, and all the spillover effects. It's shows or performances or productions, right? Some sort of an outcome from it, outputs rather. And then the education piece that affects all of society, and they cultivate it from young. So you kind of almost are building this ecosystem that supports the arts. So I could be wrong, but I kind of imagine that being a good case study that I think works well. It feels like something that people are proud about to preserve. So I imagine there are lessons to be learned from some of those examples. Like if I imagine then refugees, supporting one refugee school in Kedah has impact, has beneficiaries, has outputs and outcomes, but it's one school and it's maybe 100 kids. I would imagine if you're an organization that has clout, that has the money, that can, as you said earlier, you can hire the expertise, you probably have connections across all the different stakeholders. I'd look at what needs to change in the ecosystem across the board. And then you actually have a bigger plan as a funder. And even if this one school in Kedah is one part of that bigger plan, right? So I look at the focus, you target interconnected issues rather than isolated problems, bringing together different stakeholders, and you look at a systems change. And then having that long-term vision, what's sustainable, what's scalable, what does this whole thing need to look like with change, collaboration and innovation, what partnerships, how do we bring the right people together? Can I get government officials to sit with me? What's going on at a policy level? So on the ground, I work with 4 refugee schools to deliver on the ground impact, but I'm constantly engaging with policymakers, with bigger stakeholders, looking at systems change. And then, of course, I think M&E practices, something that nobody ever funds. Could people be offering these to us? Does this work for you? Can you adapt it to your model? Stuff like that. Because that's what we're kind of doing now. I'm running a school, we're getting funders, we're educating, we're bringing stakeholders, we're trying to play that role. But imagine if you had a very capable, driven foundation or organization that had the clout and power to think like that.
Interesting how in the model you're talking about, funding individual projects and organizations is a component of what funders should be doing with their money. And the idea of the ecosystem is a bit like having an appropriate portfolio of arenas where you put investment into. And I feel like to do that, though, goes back to one of the earliest points we were discussing, which is the requirement for the funder to understand that domain, but also to understand execution in that domain. The vision you're talking about cannot operate unless you are starting from that position. You can't afford to be getting into policy making if you don't understand the realities of implementation, because otherwise all you're doing is making up desk level stuff for systemic actors to make more poor decisions on that puts the executors into untenable positions. Even some of these M&E things can get into a place where the indicator landscape is so complicated that no reasonable person that is already overloaded with work on a daily basis and operations in life can wrap their head around it. If I just separate that then and come down towards the actual practices of how funders interact with individual organizations, what could be better there? Like, what would you say the future should look like for more effective outcomes at the beneficiary level?
Right now, I feel we're delivering on our specific outcomes, but we know that we need systems change, right? But we are limited. So then what would be nice? What would be nice is for funders to be able to actually give us that access, or for them to actually want to work on those levels and engage with those different stakeholders.
Establish that outcome for you, where they just establish that policy position, or they establish the regulatory position that then allows you as a nonprofit to operate more effectively. For example, if you need refugee kids to be able to access normal school as part of the educational journey, that's something that you have to fight for as individual or 10 individual or 100 individual organizations, either battling at individual level, or financiers or players with more clout effectively establish that for you. So then if you educate the kids in a meaningful way, then they can get jobs and then they can live meaningful lives and they have the documentation that they should have. And then you do the developmental piece without being constantly challenged by these other structural components.
Even looking at funding where, okay, we can give you $1 million or $500,000, or we can put it in these funds and you get the interest. So even us, we get money and we're like, okay, if we're not using this for the next 6 months, should we put it in? So right now I'm asking finance friends, I'm having to do that research and obviously to get to a place of confidence, where else you could have funders who many of them, this is how they've made their money, could do that for us. So things like that.
There's a very interesting point. Could funders play a more active role in how nonprofits are able to safeguard money into the future in a way that that money grows and is able to generate more money, or where the money offsets risk? Yeah, absolutely. That's a great point. Why not, right?
Exactly. Because working with refugees, you're not working with Malaysians that have rights, have access, and you just have to help them get on their feet. You're dealing with communities that are denied basic rights, and it's been 16 years and it's still the same situation, right? With the right to school, the right to work. So as you said, structural changes. But what I experienced recently was a bunch of us, different nonprofits working in different spaces, livelihoods, policy, advocacy, and all of us have various different meetings with authorities or with stakeholders, and everyone comes back with a different story. Everyone comes back with a different experience. And I just reached a point of utter frustration, because I get it if I sit with other stakeholders and they don't know the full picture. But if us as a nonprofit, if we in our own space are like, I'm confused, I'm frustrated, I was at a loss for words. Like, do we need to sit and write this on a board so that we all understand what on earth is going on here? Because I'm confused. And everyone's throwing around acronyms and timelines. And you've got refugees, migrants, alternative to detention, children without parents.
I think that funders could help unify that space. You have the power, you have the leverage. You should be in an umbrella position. Talking of which, what about portfolio visibility? What are your thoughts on the fact that often when you are being funded by a funder, you don't know anybody else. You don't even know who's in their portfolio. There's no meaningful way to really understand what they do or normalize against what they do. Like you were saying, you've got different languages, different terminologies, different methodologies. You're prioritizing different factors. Whereas in real life, those issues have the same factors. Unification is critical within a sector. And at the moment, there's an expectation that nonprofits will somehow find a way to unify themselves without financial resources, without clout or leverage in that system, while being forced to compete with each other for financing from the same financiers, while also having different belief positions or ideological positions. That's not necessarily data driven, because there is no data available to anybody. Someone should be playing that role. I think that's what we are agreeing here. It's either the financers as a collective, or the financer needs to establish a player that then does that.
I mean, and that's also our learning. I think there is some responsibility with nonprofits to also learn and develop and evolve as well, and recognize that unless you want to continue doing this forever, you need to allocate some amount of headspace and time to this, right?
It still speaks to the fact that you have to have the resources available.
Of course. I think that can only come unless you're a nonprofit set up purely to do that. Everybody else, and from my personal experience, that can only come when you can breathe.
If I can summarize some of this, if we go back and we start with the helpful practices, like taking the time to really understand the domain, really understand those organizations and the sector, to establish trust before you begin, and then maintain that trust and in an active relationship. There's due diligence in understanding domain, understanding the organization, understanding the sector, but in a way that isn't one-sided and isn't onerous for nonprofits, in a way that establishes a trustable and trusted relationship in both directions. And then the other thing you talk about, good practice, would be around the longer term commitments that gives you that breathing space, that allows you to sit down and think about longer term things, from vision to planning to outcomes. And then I guess learning from the bad practices or the less helpful ones, good practice would be sticking with domains, picking something, sticking with it, seeing it through instead of switching on a rolling basis, aiming for financial amounts that are meaningful for that issue and for that enterprise and for that sector. And ideally unrestricted funding, because if you've got good trust and you've established that the planning is solid and enterprise leaders know what they're doing, you should just be able to provide unrestricted funding against outcome reporting. Other things you mentioned that might be good practices: reduce the pressure on nonprofits to overpromise. If you understand that domain, that sector, those organizations, you can understand what is reasonable and meaningful. And when people overpromise, you can pull it back and go like, realistically, I don't see how you're going to do that. So I feel like that's part of that active relationship. If people make promises, you should be able to rely on them. So we got those as a set of good practices, and moving into what you talked about as a more ideal future where you take all of these practices related to the funder non-profit relationship and then make that one component of the wider landscape that a funder is putting money into, like how art and culture is funded, where you're not just funding individual organizations, but you are funding all the bits that make up that space, including education and engaging people when they are young and dealing with societal perceptions, building their ecosystems, building the expertise, having a bigger plan for where these things should be and what the outcomes should look like, targeting interconnected issues, trying to play a role in actively driving system change, financing meaningful M&E, short-term, long-term, that allows everybody to learn, as well as to be able to demonstrate success and successful models.
I think on an individual level, if I supported a family or a small business and I stuck with them for a few years and I saw them grow and I saw them get on their feet and have children, like, you imagine just on a very simple level how meaningful that relationship becomes, and to see those real outcomes, it makes sense to stick to that and to really invest your energy, your time, your emotion into something versus jumping around like a frog.
Yeah, always happy note. I would like to say thank you so much for the time you spent today. That was super illuminating, and I got some really good points out of that. I hope that funders do someday really try and build some of these practices and ideas. I guess one of my commitments to all of this is to try and see how we can support funders in making these transitions and making these things viable and practical so that they can in fact play that more active, meta, trusted role in the system as compared to just simply representing money to everybody. I'm sure your thoughts will play a role in all of this. I appreciate it. Thank you so much, Deborah.